Hello and welcome everyone to another exciting topic with the biblical perspective. And what's exciting is that we are actually joined with liferadio.uk. So that's liferadio.uk. And what is good about this is that you can send your WhatsApp messages to 07311 409 409 to Life Radio UK. So that's a WhatsApp number 0711 409 409. And that's for your questions and comments. Okay. You're joined with me here to my left, your right, Pedro Antonius and Colleen Dixon, looking as lovely as ever. And you can't hear, if you do hear a disembodied voice, it's our media director. Colleen, actually our social media director. We have a media director who is Simon, and we have the director of the Biblical Perspective, which is Pedro Antonius. And I'm here just to direct. That's all. But I want to thank you for joining us. And we're actually also on Facebook. We're actually on, again, Life Radio UK and here at the Biblical Perspective. And we are glad that you can join us. And the topic today is sorry, I'm just a bit like, because it's a topic that's going to be a bit emotive, but I'm going to tell you the topic now. Have Christians changed their views on sexual purity? And it may be emotive, but you can post your comments to the chat because I'll be answering the questions and comments, and we'll be leading out with the questions, but I'll be answering them. So without further ado, because it's going to be a very interesting topic, have Christians changed their view on sexual purity? We'll go and have a prayer with the creator of all of this. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your wonder and your love and your kindness and your grace and your goodness. You've not brought us here by chance, but by design, because you want not just us, but the viewing audience on Live Radio UK, on Facebook, and on the Biblical Perspective to understand this topic from the biblical perspective. And I pray that the viewers joining us today will get a blessing from what they hear today and have their questions and comments answered via us through the power of your Holy Spirit. Thank you for using us, and thank you for allowing us to be willing to be used. Bless this study. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Yeah. Amen. I'll say again, have Christians changed their views on sexual purity? Colleen, what do you think about that? I've got my thoughts on it. And obviously you might have yours, but as you're leading out, what do you think? Have they? Haven't they?
Well, there's different things happening in society at the moment that's impacting on this question of sexual purity. Yeah. And one of the main issues that we're finding in modern day society is that individuals are getting married later and later and later in life. So, you know, many years ago, people used to get married like in their early 20s, but now individuals are putting off marriage until, you know, in their 30s, even in their 40s, maybe because they're like trying to pursue their careers or not finding the right person. So the whole issue of sexual purity, you know, becomes quite relevant and quite important, more so in previous times now because of, you know, because of this issue. And also as well, like society has become more and more and more sexualized, and there are more and there's more access to things like, even to something like porn, and that's not a topic that we discuss regularly when it comes to, you know, church and church topics. So you've got people getting married later and later, and you've got an increase in you know, this with sexuality on TV, within films. You've got an increase in things like porn. So there's like even more pressure in relation to sexual purity now. We've been in the future, so the question is like, you know, with changing society and everything that's happening, how important is the question of sex to the Christian faith? And that's actually the first question I'm going to start with, Pedro. But there
Oh, sorry.
are things that are different now than they were before. So I'm not sure. What about yourself, Ruth?
Well, before that, you mentioned two things, which I was like thinking, okay. So you're saying, before Pedro goes into his questions, you said that sexual purity is an issue because people are getting married later. So is sexual purity pre-marriage? Because I'm looking at it as a pre-marriage, post-marriage thing. And then you mentioned about porn on the rise. Is porn only for pre-marital people? So I was just hearing that coming through. What do I think about that? I think you've hit some issues there to do with getting married later, and then the porn to add to it. What an explosive combination to do. You know what I mean? It's explosive because then you've got, which one is it, the chicken or the egg? Is it getting married later? Not getting married at all? Is it happening in marriage, whether you've married young or married old or never been married at all? Is this sexual purity just a generic thing across the board for everyone? And I know you're going to explore that with Pedro, and I'm excited to see what will come out of this topic. So yeah, I'll leave over to you.
So yes, Pedro, bearing in mind everything that myself and Ruth have said, my first question, which is just a repeat of what I've just said, really, is how important is this whole issue of sexual purity to the Christian faith?
Thank you for the question. Before we answer this question, we first need to agree on something.
Okay.
We need to agree because you're speaking about the Christian faith. We need to agree that Jesus Christ is the founder of the Christian faith. Not Paul, not Peter, not John, not Apollos, or any other person we may meet in the Bible. Jesus is the founder of the Christian faith. That Christian faith is based on what Jesus taught his disciples. What Jesus taught his disciples comes from what Jesus himself called the scriptures, which today we call the Old Testament. So do we agree on this?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if we agree on this, we can go on to say that the question of sexual purity is very important to the Christian faith. And how do we know that? We know that because of how Jesus himself brought the issue up in the Gospels. For instance, if you go to Matthew chapter 5 and you read for me verse 27, we can have an idea of how Jesus brought this question of sexual purity up in his teachings.
Okay, so Matthew 5:27, and it says, reading from the King James Version, "You have heard that it was said by them of old times, thou shalt not commit adultery."
Okay. Read. Can you read also verse 28, please, if you have it?
Yes, 28. I'm just going to go further down. Says, "But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart."
Okay, Simon will forgive me for that. So Jesus is saying, you have heard, and remember, we started on the premise that the Christian faith is based on what Jesus calls scriptures. And
Yes.
and here he says to them, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. That's Jesus teaching his disciples. By the way, this is in what is known as his inaugural sermon. That means his first sermon ever recorded. We call it the Sermon on the Mount. And
Mm.
everybody will agree to say that's the greatest sermon that Jesus ever gave in the entire gospel. And right at the beginning of this sermon, this is what he says. You have heard that you shall not commit adultery, but I'm telling you, whoever looks at a woman with lust has committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, we said that Jesus based the teaching of the Christian faith on the scriptures, which we call the Old Testament. And what we see is he is quoting actually from Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 18. And Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 18 is just the written version of Exodus 20, verse 14, when God himself spoke from the top of the mountain within what we call the 10 commandments. So Jesus says, it's not just about going and committing adultery as a physical act, but it's thinking it in your mind. So what we see here is the founder of the Christian faith is actually doing what you call a radicalization of the law. The law says don't do it. He says don't think it. That's a radicalization of the law. And that's the founder of Christianity. So is the question of sexual purity an important topic for Jesus? Let's recap. First sermon, greatest sermon. Jesus says, I'm going to go further. I'm going to take the law on the sexual conduct of Christians a higher level. The law says, don't do it. Don't commit adultery. I'm saying, don't even think it, because the moment you think it, you've done it. So the question now is, how does adultery relate to the question of sexual purity? What is adultery? This is where I invite you to go to the scriptures that Jesus used in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22. Let's discover what adultery is so that we can understand the radicalization of it from Jesus's perspective.
Okay. If a man be found lying with a woman married to an husband, then they shall both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman. So shall thou put away evil from Israel.
This text is probably something Jesus had in mind because he is talking about adultery, or even though he just quoted the seventh commandment in the 10 commandments. Here, sometimes we can miss something essential by focusing on something important. I repeat, sometimes we can miss something essential by focusing on something important. What is more? Is it important or essential that is more?
Essential.
Essential is more than important. Now, in this text, what you see what is important is you need to understand that you should not sleep with your brother's wife. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
You should not have sexual relations with your brother or your neighbor's wife in the text. But the idea really is both ways. You should not do that with your husband's sister either. Okay? But let's stick to the text. Now, this is what is important, but I want you to notice what is essential in this text. And that answers to the question of how important it is to Jesus. What is essential in this text is that it says the moment. So what is important is you should not do that. But what is essential is to understand that the moment you have done this, you have put a curse among your community. You have gone and slept with somebody's husband or wife in the community, and that is bad. But the consequences, and this is again why this is important to the Christian faith and to Jesus in his first ever sermon recorded in the Gospels. When you have done that, you have brought a curse among your community, among your congregation, and that curse now needs to be purged. And if you think that this is stretched, just look at the text. The text says the two people who do that must die so that that community may be released from the curse. Now, let me ask you this. What is an unclean spirit? Do you know what is an unclean spirit?
One that is gone against the order of God.
Yeah, like a spirit that's not of God.
Okay. What do unclean spirits do? We're talking about demons, basically, right?
Yeah.
An unclean spirit in the Bible is a demon.
Yeah.
Do we agree on this? We will not discussing demonology.
Yeah. And, and they cause chaos and problems. The spirit never brings anything good with it. It always brings discord and disharmony, or whatever they do in their demon realm.
Okay. So I remind your question is how important is this question of sexual purity to the Christian faith? I remind that the Christian faith is based on what Jesus taught. What Jesus taught is based on what Jesus called the scriptures. And the scriptures is what we call today the Old Testament. And I remind ourselves that Jesus says, you have heard this is what the scriptures say, but I'm going to radicalize that. I am telling you, this is to tell you how important it is for Jesus, how Christians should behave, even their minds, with respect to purity. He says, you have heard that you should not go and do this. You're not even thinking. And we saw consequence is not for the people who do this, but for the people who live among them. And it's a curse. Now, let me invite you to read the book, in the book of another text that Jesus mind, Leviticus chapter 18, verse 20. Please.
Okay, and Leviticus 20, the King James Version, it says, moreover, thou not lie carnally neighbor's wife to defile thyself with her.
what is important here again is to notice the text says, once you do that with your neighbor's wife, and I said conversely, it is true with your neighbor's husband, you defile yourself. What does that mean? That means that you disqualify. This is purity language. Defilement stands in opposition to purity. How important is the question of purity, sexual purity, to the Christian faith? You defile yourself. So in some way, in the spirit of the text, you have disqualified yourself in your standing with God and with other people around you. That's the spirit of the text here. Whether we like it or we don't, whether we accept it or we don't, because I know these things are touchy subjects. This is the spirit of the text. So, how important it is? Do you have an idea to the Christian faith, sexual purity?
It is very,
based
it
on
is, ve-
yeah,
it is very important. It is so important that a viewer has asked a question. Those of you on liveradio.uk, remember that you can share your questions or comments on WhatsApp, and the number is 073 11 409 409. I'll be looking forward to hearing, what you've got to say at a later time. But the questions come in. It says, I'm confused. Is this message about adultery or purity? Because I thought sexual purity was about abstaining from sexual activity before you were married.
yeah.
Are
That's an
these
excellent
people
question,
married?
That's an excellent question, Ruth. I was thinking that, and I've got a question, and then I have got a question specifically about that, because I do feel as though that it's very much like married couples and adultery, and I was always under the impression that adultery is within the context of marriage, while fornication is for those who are unmarried. So Pedro, I am coming with that question, and the viewer who has asked that question, I'm going to ask that question, so please bear with me. But before I go on to that question, Pedro, I wanted to ask, in relation to what you've just said about did Jesus not change this whole thing that you've talked about when he saved the woman in John 8? And then I
This
want to
is
go
an
on to the
interesting
whole.
story. Yeah,
Okay.
this is an interesting story, and again, I repeat, this person who asked this question, just bear with us. We will come to this. We're moving into this, but I can already say that sexual purity touches all aspects of sexuality, whether you're married or you're unmarried. So we are within the topic, and we will address the different aspects of it. Now, if you go to that story for me and you read John 8, it's a long story. We won't deal with every point. But if you go to John 8 and you read for me verses 4 to 11, please.
Okay, John 8, 4 to 11. They say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down, and with his finger wrote on the ground, as though he heard them not.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
did you read
So
until 11?
Yes, I'm going to read into 11. Although, as though he heard them not, something's happened. Yeah, so when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said, I said unto them, he that is without sin among you, let him cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. Sorry about that.
So quickly, I took that whole story because you asked the question, did not Jesus change all of this through the story of John 8? And this is the mindset that people, Christians, have sometimes when there is an issue of sexual immorality or impurity in the church. Very often you will hear somebody somehow say, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And that is quoting Jesus. And even though we don't overtly say that the question has been dismissed by Jesus, by quoting, let him who is without sin cast the first stone, we intentionally convey the idea, look, you haven't got anything to say here, all right? Because we're all sinners. This is the type of attitude that we have. And I have to address that because the question is the question of sexual purity. Have Christians changed their minds on that, their views on that? And the answer will be, oh, no, we haven't changed our views. But then in that story, it will be repeated over and over again. Let him who has no sin cast the first stone. So for the people who like to hijack that story and somehow misquote Jesus or misuse the story, I'd like to tell them the point of this is in verse 11. What happens in verse 11 is that Jesus is not condoning the immoral lifestyle of this woman. To the contrary, Jesus commands her to go and to put an end to it.
No more.
Jesus says, go and sin no more. That means go and don't do that again. Stop it right here. I want you to notice that this is a command from Jesus. It's not an advice. It's not a suggestion. It's a command.
Yeah.
Stop it. You got away this time. But I'm telling you, you need to stop that right as you leave me. So no, Jesus has not changed and canceled sexual purity through that story. And I'd like you to read this time for me in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, please. And we will see that his disciples after him taught the same thing.
Yeah.
Hebrews 13:4. I'm reading from the King James Version, and it says, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge.
Wow.
Here is a disciple of Jesus talking about adultery, and I want you to not focus on adultery, but focus on sexual immorality. You see, the text, God will judge the immoral. And
Yeah.
I invite the person who asked the question about fornication to start listening very carefully from this point. Adultery, when the text says, do not defile the marital bed, that means marriage is between two people. Do not bring an addition to it. Do not bring a third person or a fourth or a fifth. It has to remain two within the context of sexuality. But then, if you think about it further, the way Jesus thought about it, it's not just about sexuality on the bed physically, but also in your mind. So we need to think much larger on this than we would want to think, because we're talking about the Christian faith. Have we changed our views on sexual purity? So when the text says again, do not commit adultery, keep the marital bed pure, do not bring an addition, it's not just about having somebody physically in the bed who is not your wife or your husband. It's about do not entertain that idea in your mind, because if you do, you are immoral, and God will judge you for that. Is that powerful?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, it is. Because I was thinking there, Pedro, when you're saying that it's not just confined to the marital bed. You could be anywhere, but you take your brain with you, and your brain is where the immorality stems from. And then you go to the bedroom to finish off it in your brain about an hour ago, 2 hours ago. You know, it never just starts, boom, right there in the bedroom. Because I'm just thinking about, if you're saying that, then that whether you're single, you could struggle with sexual purity. So, because I'm thinking about the viewer, what you mentioned, because it doesn't mean it's confined to marriage because of the mind.
We're going to get into that.
Yeah. I was just trying to clarify that when you said it doesn't start in the bedroom.
Pedro, before I go on to my final question dealing with this whole idea of adultery, fornication, because you focused on adultery and you've talked a lot about marriage, there's actually a question that relates specifically to that's come up on the chat that I wanted you to quickly address before I talk about the unmarried and the married. And the question says, people in marriage who enjoy porn together or use toys, for example, sex toys, is that still purity because there's no other people involved? Really, fornication is the act of sex, and adultery is the heart issue. So what we've got here, Pedro, is we're saying, okay, so say an individual is married and there isn't a third party, there is no adultery, there is no additional person brought into the room, but the couple say watch porn in order to enrich, I don't know if that's the word, their sexual life, or they use toys. I don't know. I'm not sure about you, Ruth, but sometimes I see these adverts on TV where they send like undisclosed like envelopes with like sex toys. They said, oh, they can send these sex toys, and these are like consenting adults who are in a marriage relationship. So the question then is this okay? Because we're talking about sexual purity, and we're trying to understand if even within context of being within a marriage and there's no additional party, you know, can you overstep or go outside the realms of sexual purity?
And I want to add to that. You want to add to that, Colleen, fetishes. People have fetishes, and it doesn't involve a third party. It's just between the husband and the wife, and they like to dress up in certain costumes, right? And if that's not your job, right? So there's all come into play now, and because it's a 21st century, it doesn't mean that they didn't have that such things back then in a different way. But it's just that people can do it now because there's more, as you said, to send things through the post or whatever. So this is such a wow topic.
Okay.
So thanks for that.
Just quickly, Pedro, before you answer that question, a comment has just come in that I think is really important, and it relates exactly to the point I've just made. The comment says, bringing in porn is a third party. There is lust involved. So maybe that will address the porn element.
Okay.
This is why, let me make it clear to you now why we started the way we started. We started with Jesus radicalizing the law. And I can understand the frustration because it may not have been understood, but now it's going to be very clear. When Jesus moves from the realm of physicality to the realm of emotions and imagination, to the realm of spirit and conscience, he is covering all aspects. Now, I'd like the person who spoke about watching consensually immorality on TV, because we're going to see that in a second. Watching immorality on a consensual basis between husband and wife, I want the person to think about what Jesus says about what's going on in your mind. So, what is going on in your mind, and how does it affect marital bed? This is why I started the way I started, because I knew we would reach this point. And now it is up to us to analyze what has been said. What has been said is immorality or adultery, we started with that, is something that brings a curse upon the people who practice it, and a curse upon the people who live around these people. In the time of the Bible, God said death is what is going to purge this thing out. By the way, that is not practiced today in Christianity, but it's practiced all over the world in other religions. Now, I don't know. I'm just throwing this. And by the way, I'm not saying this should be practiced, but I'm just saying this is something that is well and alive today. Now, and then Jesus says, look, it's not that I don't care what you read, but I'm telling you now, as far as the Christian faith is concerned, we live by faith. What happens to our faith is based on what is in our hearts and our minds. And he is saying, you have heard that you will not go and commit this act. I'm telling you that this act which is worthy of death and that brings a curse upon people who practice it and people around those who practice it, you should not involve yourself in your heart and your mind in it, because the result is still the same, because it's the same sin. Then we progressed to say, Jesus clearly said, if you have been in this, you need to end it. There is no other remedy for it. You need to end it. And then we moved on to the text that says, the last one, there is adultery in the marital bed. And what it does, if there is, it defiles yourself. It makes you unclean. And I ask you the question, what is an unclean spirit? It makes you
A
unclean.
demon. A
Now,
demon.
you tell me, when you constantly watch and then you do, you know, all the little things you can do with assistance, material assistance, and I'm not discussing this thing. I'm only interested in what is going on in your mind. If there is something going on in your mind, and I guess there is, it has to be checked. On what side is it? Is it on the side of morality, or is it on the side of immorality? So there you should find your answer as to what you can do with you know, your spouse in your own sphere, confined environment, and how. Because Jesus is interested in what is going on in your mind. And like the person
Yeah.
said, if your mind is being prompted and motivated by some people who are actually practicing immorality, I think there is an issue here.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I agree, Pedro, because there's a concept called cook hold, right? And it's to do with, which is surprising, it's a husband of an adulterous woman. What these men like to do, and you're right, it starts in the mind, and it is demonic. It's a man that likes to watch his wife go with someone else, and the other one to that is a cooking, which is the wife of an adulterous husband. So she will, watch the husband with another woman, but it starts in the mind, and it is demonic, because the Bible talks about the married bed should be undefiled. So what place are these things in your marital relation? So I'm glad that you broke it down and brought it to that.
Yeah, and also as well, to add to that, if we think about porn, because this is an important point. If you think about porn and pornography, the individuals who are partaking in porn are not themselves married. Like, the individuals who are partaking in porn are kind of like doing it. They're being paid to have sexual intercourse with someone who they may or may not know. Now, straight away, this is automatically outside of God's will. So why would we bring that in to the marriage bed? In addition to that, we know that from research and what information that we know, that porn, is detrimental to individuals personally and to family, and it leads to addiction. And the issue with porn as well, I mean, not to make this a porn discussion, is that and we are short on time, is that it kind of like escalates in that people want to try new and novel thing within this whole context of porn. So we can't say and bring that into a Christian home. It's just not right in itself. And that's why it's important that we go back to the initial points that we made about in your mind about sexual purity and immorality.
Yeah.
Can I just move on, Pedro? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think we do need to do that.
Yeah, so quickly. The comment was made about married and unmarried, and like when you started off this conversation and this discussion, and also as we've progressed, in my mind I'm thinking, well, okay, this is a discussion for married couples. This is like a different conversation, and I'm not saying that there isn't impurity within that, but do we not need to like think about adultery in one aspect, but also fornication in another? And adultery is for married people. Well, it is for married people, and for the unmarried people, what about them? It's obviously something else, which I understand to be fornication. So yeah, what about the unmarried people?
Okay, so
Focus
if
on
we go back to
adultery.
Okay, so if we go back to the last text that we had, I want you to notice something. Um, we have two words in this text. If Simon can put it back on the screen for us, that's Hebrews 13 verse 4. I want you to notice something, and we're going to address this question. So you have two words here, but one in particular uh, that we need to pay attention to. The first, so we have the word adulterous. So we've spoken about adultery, but we also have the word immoral. And the text says God will judge the immoral and adulterous. This is very
Yeah.
important because this word adulterous is the word from which you have noticed, you have mentioned it several times. The word immoral here, immoral, not adulterous, immoral, is the word from which we have the words fornicators and fornication. And that's the Greek word porneia. And in here, it's pornos. So you have fornication is porneia, from which you have the word pornography, which is a compound word, which means immoral writings or writings immoral. So this is the word immoral here in the context of the marital bed. That means in this marital bed, you have people who can be who can defile this bed in two different ways. And that will address your question. So the question is, what is fornication? Now, I want you to read a text for me, which is 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. And this is where the discussion is going to be interesting for people who are interested in the other aspect. So 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1, please.
It is reported commonly that there is fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife.
Okay. Notice in this text that you have the word fornication twice, but it is
Yes.
also within the context of adultery. So much that the text is informing us that there is a young man, and I have all reasons to believe it's a young man. I don't have time to go into details, but it is a young man who is having sexual relationships, therefore unlawful sexual activities with his father's wife. Probably they even live in the same house. The idea here is, and I'm pretty sure that this wife was not that older than this young man, according to culture and what we can gather. But Paul is saying this is fornication. This is immorality. That means this young man is not married, but he is having sexual intercourse with a married woman. So, is that sexual impurity?
Yes.
Are we
Yes,
still
it
within the
is.
question of sexual purity here? Now,
Yes.
we then defined fornication as opposed to adultery. Within this text, one commits fornication and the other one commits adultery, but both of them are in the same sin. So it's easy for us to focus on one and not on the other, but I want to tell you that everything we said about the first one is true for the second one. So
Yeah.
people who are not married and who involve themselves in sexual activities, whether with people who are married or people who are not married, they commit fornication, and it stands at the same level as adultery. And I'd like to go further with that, with you. If you go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, and I want to warn you, this text has something in it that we're not dealing with today, maybe next time.
Okay.
But we're going to
I'll read
focus
this.
on what.
I'll read
Sorry?
this quickly because we are short on time. Matthew 5:32. I'm reading from the King James Version, and it says, "But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, saying, For the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery."
Okay, so what I was saying was we're not dealing with marriage and divorce here in this text. What is interesting for us here is if somebody can divorce a woman for cause of fornication, what does that mean? Here we are
That,
with the question about people who are unmarried. What this text means here is if you marry a woman, a young girl, and you discover that she had had sex with other people before you got married to her, that means she had had fornication. Then you can dissolve the marriage. I know this sounds outrageous today in the 21st century, in 2022, where nobody thinks that, I wouldn't say nobody, but the vast majority of us thinks that getting into a marriage with a little experience in sexuality is something wonderful. But here, Jesus still, in the first sermon he preached, he said, if a man finds a woman who has had sex with somebody else before he got married to her, that's reason enough to dissolve this marriage. We're talking about young people, people who are not married and who are involved in sexual activities. This is Christ talking here. This is what he teaches, and this is what the Christian faith is supposed to uphold as his teaching in the context of sexual behavior. But is this the case? I'm pretty sure that what I'm saying right now sounds ridiculous for so many people. What are you saying? If a girl slept with somebody else and then she marries somebody and the person finds she's not a virgin, the person can dissolve them. Yes, that's the Christian faith. That's the Christian faith.
wow. That's
Have
interesting. I think
Christians change
that's
their
very
views?
interesting. That's very interesting because I know that later on in next month we are going to be touching on marriage, touching on divorce and remarriage. So I think we will have to address this at that point.
Sorry, Colin. Can I ask you to read two texts for me very quickly because we're running out of time, and this is very,
Yes.
very important. If you go to Ephesians chapter 5, verse 3, and then also 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, this needs to get in.
Okay, but fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not be once named among you as becometh saints.
This is very clear. Paul is saying to The church, by the way, the book of Ephesians is the crown in the jewelry of what you call ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is the science of church. They don't even believe, scholars don't even believe that Paul wrote this book. That is because it's too advanced in its theology of church. And Paul is saying, let fornication not even be mentioned among you. Have Christians changed their views on sexual purity? Why is this? I want you to read the second text in 1 Corinthians 6:18 for me, please, also as quickly.
And it says, King James Version, it says, flee fornication. Every sin that a man doth is without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body.
Flee fornication. That means before. And you know, the reason why so many people get into adultery today, it's because of their past of fornication in most cases. You go to hard drugs when you started with soft ones. This is the principle here. So Christians, young people, unmarried people need to take notice of this. And I want you finally to read what Jesus says again in his first sermon. This time, Matthew chapter 5, verse 28, and then Matthew 15, verse 19. Please.
Okay. But I say unto you that whoso looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart.
This is
And
the
then
problem we have. Just there.
Yeah.
This is the problem we have today. We have shifted our minds. We no longer think of adultery and fornication as something that happens in isolation and within ourselves. Why? Because the entire industry, as Colin you were saying, has sexualized, highly sexualized the world. You want to buy a yogurt to eat, it's a naked woman they show you. You want to buy a car or a pair of shoes just to go from point A to point B, they show you
Yes.
a half-naked woman. What has that got to do with eating yogurt or driving a car or buying a pair of shoes? Absolutely
Nothing at all.
nothing, except they want us to live in a permanent state of immorality in our minds. And the last
I
text,
agree.
please. 15:19.
Yeah, for out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. You can't get clearer than that, Pedro.
I will just say this. You see again, adultery and fornication stand side by side.
Yeah.
But adultery is dealt with first because we teach our children through society what morality is and what morality isn't. They may choose to follow us or they may choose to do otherwise. But it's in our minds that everything takes place.
Amen. I want to say thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pedro. And viewers, I hope you had an interesting study with a biblical perspective on have Christians changed their views on sexual purity. If you want to learn more about it, here you go. And in here, fornication is mentioned 67 times, which means it's a very important topic, and adultery even more. So join us again next week and with Life Radio UK for another biblical perspective on another exciting topic, and you'll have to wait to find out. But I hope you have a good week. Take away what you've learned. God bless you. Bye-bye.